Hey, Brook Scholars, welcome back to Remote Learning with me, Mr. Scott. It's Friday, end of the week. It is May 29th, and it is our ABC countdown to summer. We are at K, the letters K and L. So stands for kindness. So today, be really kind to the people in your family. Do something nice for them. Give them a smile. Just give them a compliment, a quick shout out. Tell them how incredibly wonderful and fabulous they are. So that's K for kindness. Now, the next letter is letter, L for letter. Now, that doesn't mean write a letter. This is kind of interesting. So you pick a letter, right? And then you try to collect and gather as many objects as you can that start with that letter. Let me give you an example. So if you were to choose the letter S, for example, you might get yourself a spoon, you might get yourself a straw, you might get yourself a sieve, and you might get yourself a Scot. Yeah, so try that today. A lot of fun. Good times. Okay, so let's get into our reading for today. It is a fiction work, but this is a little bit different. It's a folk tale. But not only is it a folk tale, it's also what's considered a legend. And I don't think we've talked very much about legends and what they are. So a legend is a story that takes place and it involves people who did exist, but the problem is that it's not very we're not exactly sure how it happened and how it went down. So it's a folktale because people will continue telling this story, and the hero, if you will, the main character of this is King Alfred, and he was a real king, but he was king a very long time ago. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So we know many of the things that he did, but we're not exactly sure on the details. So as you can tell by the title here, we've got Retold by James Baldwin. So it's a retelling of a story, a folk tale, legend. And so we've got to keep that in mind. So when I was choosing this piece, then I practiced going through a retell, and I was like, why is this retell so much harder than anything else? It's a pretty straightforward story. You can figure out what happens. But I worked out that the reason that this was so difficult was because it required a lot of context. Now, context, what is that? Well, context means that you need to explain right in the beginning of your retell what life was like during that time period for people. What was actually going on? What was the scene? What was the scenario? What was the situation? What were all the details that you need to know in order to understand the story itself? So simply just going through and telling the events and the stuff that happened isn't enough for this kind of a retell. You really need to make sure that you are explaining about the setting and the context. Okay, just before we get started, I've got on my black Adidas cap and a black T-shirt, which isn't very fun, but it will be when I take this absolutely enormous scarf and wrap it around myself. There we go. Accessories week, going out strong. Woo! Kind of stay. Okay, here we go. I got a little too tight. I'm choking to death. Okay. King Alfred and the Beggar. Interesting. Let's see what's going on here. At one time, the Danes drove King Alfred from his kingdom, and he had to hide for a long time on a little island in a river. Now, did you spot that there? Yep, there is a footnote here, my friends. Sometimes footnotes are numbered. It's one, two, three, etc. This time, it's just an asterisk there. The asterisk tells us that we need to follow that footnote down to the bottom of the page where footnotes live. And it says Danes, soldiers from Denmark. Okay, all right. And he had to hide in a little island in the river. We're going to come back to that very all important first sentence a little bit later on. Anyway, one day all who were on the island, except the king and queen and one servant, went out to fish. It was a very lonely place, and no one could get to it except by boat. At about noon, a ragged beggar came to the king's door and asked for food. The king called the servant and asked, "How much food have we in the house?" "My lord," said the servant, "we only have one loaf and a little milk." Then the king said, "Give half of the loaf and half of the milk to this poor man." The servant did as he was told. The beggar thanked the king for his kindness and went on his way. In the afternoon, the men who had gone out to fish came back. They had three boats full of fish, and they said, "We have caught many fish today." Then we have caught more fish today than in all the other days that we've been on this island." The king was glad, and he and his people were more hopeful than they ever had been before. When night came, the king lay awake for a long time and thought about the things that had happened that day. At last he thought that he saw a great light, like the sun, and in the midst of the light there stood an old man with black hair holding a book open in his hand. It may have all been a dream, and yet to the king it seemed very real indeed. He looked and wondered, but was not afraid. "Who are you?" he asked of the old man. "Alfred, my son, be brave," said the man, "for I am the one to whom you give this day the half of all the food that you had. Be strong and joyful of heart, and listen to what I say. Rise up early in the morning and blow your horn 3 times, so loudly that the Danes may hear it. By 9 o'clock, 500 men will be around you ready to be led into battle. Go forth bravely, and within 7 days your enemies shall be beaten, and you shall go back to your kingdom to rule in peace." Then the light went out, and the man was seen no more. In the morning the king rose early and crossed over to the mainland. Then he blew his horn 3 times very loudly, and when his friends heard it, they were glad, but the Danes were filled with fear. At 9 o'clock, 500 of his bravest soldiers stood around him ready for battle. He spoke and told them what he had seen and heard in his dream, and when he had finished, they all cheered loudly and said they would follow him and fight him for him as long as they had strength. So they went out bravely to battle, and they beat the Danes and drove them back into their own place. And King Alfred ruled wisely and well over all of his people for the rest of his days. There you have it. Okay, so great story. Loved the happy ending. Now it's time to retell. And the thing that makes this a little bit tricky, as I said, is all about the context. What was life like? If you start off by saying there was this king on an island and he was doing some stuff, you haven't fully explained what the situation is, and that's called context. So let's see if I can describe this. Now, what they do here is they give you the context in the first sentence. Sometimes in a fiction piece like this, they will actually put it in a blurb up top. But for whatever reason, James Baldwin, who retold this story, decided that he would put it in the first sentence. So let's read that one more time because I think that is the key to having a really successful retell where we give the information and explain fully why it is happening the way that it does. At one time the Danes drove King Arthur from his kingdom, and he had to hide for a long time on a little island in a river. Well, hey, your turn. Here's what I want you to do. Smash that pause button and do a retell. See if you can explain what was happening before Alfred and his soldiers went out to battle the Danes. All right, practice your retell and then come on back. Pause. Okay, so here we go. Let's see if your retell matches up with mine. So this story takes place a very, very long time ago, and it happened to a king, and the king was named was King Alfred, and he was living in a place where he was ruling. He had his kingdom and all of his people, but then a group of soldiers from Denmark called the Danes came along and they battled him out of where he was living with his kingdom and with his people, and they had to go and live on an island in a river, and they were really, really unhappy about this. Okay, so that is got to be the first part of your retell, something to explain what was happening before the events took place. Now we can get started retelling the story, having put all of that wonderful context in the beginning. So they were on the island, and all of the people had gone out to fish, and there were only 3 people left on the island: the king, the queen, and a servant. And then a beggar came to the door, and instead of turning the beggar away, the king said, "Give him half of everything that we have." And so the beggar went off, and when the men returned from fishing, excuse me, they said they'd had quite the catch, a really big haul, fish for everyone, and everyone ate, and they were very, very hopeful. King Alfred goes to bed, and he kind of is awoken in the middle of the night by this old man who comes to him holding a book open and says, "Do not worry, Arthur." And the man says, You just need to wake up early in the morning, blow your horn 3 times, collect your soldiers, go into battle, and after 7 days, the Danes will have gone back to where they belong in Denmark, and you shall be ruler again and king. And that is exactly what King Arthur did the next day. He awoke and summoned his men, and they all went out to battle, and they defeated the Danes. Very good. Okay, my friends. Well, that is how you retell a legend. You got to make sure that you include the context before you start talking about all of the different events. Well done. So, all you need to do now, of course, is to answer the short answer and multiple choice questions, snap a photo, and upload it to Seesaw. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you have a great weekend, my friends, and I will see you on Monday. From Mr. Scott, the Ultimate Champion. Bye.